Welcome to You and Your Democracy. It's a short take civics lesson as part of our program, Where Do We Go From Here? I'm Chuck Parkinson. Each episode, we will look at the head and heart of democracy. We will explore the values and the principles that have created our American exceptionalism and examine the structures and institutions that give us the guardrails of our democratic republic. To quote Benjamin Franklin when asked in 1787 after the Constitutional Convention, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or monarchy?" To which Franklin responded with a rejoinder at once witty and ominous: "A republic if you can keep it." So now let's take a look at what is this great American experiment, and then ask, what do we need to do to keep it? In today's episode, we will discuss executive power. What is it, and when is it too much? I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. John Van Benthuysen, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Black Hills State University. Thanks for joining us today, John.
It's good to be with you, Chuck.
Well, let's jump right in. What is executive power?
Well, when we're talking about executive power, we're really talking about a bundle of different types of powers. And some of your viewers might be familiar with express powers. These are powers that are explicitly written in the Constitution. They cover things like commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the ability to sign treaties. These are the powers that most Americans, I think, are familiar with. There's also delegated powers that are granted to both the president and the executive branch bureaucracy by Congress. So Congress writes laws, in many cases complex laws, and it is ultimately the duty of the president to execute that. There's also implied powers, recognition that future events may call upon the need for powers that have not been identified yet to achieve what is necessary and proper for government. Those are kind of the three basic powers that you're going to come across in a intro to political science class. There's one I would like to add, though, it's really intangible in some respects, and that's soft power. And that really hinges upon the individual in office. And so, what soft power refers to is, well, it can be charisma, the charisma of an individual to kind of convince people to do what they want, which enhances the power of the president. But it could also be things like the values or the integrity of an individual as well that are attractive to people. And so when you combine these different types of power, express, delegated, implied, and soft power, you really have a massive concentration of potential power in the office of the presidency. Um, Now, when we kind of step back and look at this historically, we see a decisive trend of greater concentration of power within the office of the presidency. Why is this the case? Usually it's in response to big crises like war and economic calamity, like the Great Depression, where Americans are suffering and they demand decisive action from the executive branch and the president in particular. So, to answer that question, when is executive power too much? It really depends on the moment in question and how Americans are feeling. If they're feeling insecure, if there's crisis, then they're going to want a decisive president with enough power to get the job done. And that's where it stands right now. So it really depends on how much power is too much power.
I think what that goes back to, as you raise that point, in the original, in the Constitution originally, with the three branches of government and the checks and balances that existed, there have been periods of time when presidents have had to rise to that occasion. But there's also been the case where Congress has kind of delegated a lot of powers, executive powers, beyond those, and it goes to the point of the soft power that you're talking about, and also those powers that are kind of expressed with, as we've gotten more complex in our governmental operations, where we have regulatory things that go along with. Like Congress does not write regulations, but they certainly have an approval. They could object to regulations if they were written in such a way. Is that an example that we could go in, or is that kind of in between what is written into the fact where the Constitution outlines what the executive powers are and what the soft power might be?
Well, I think if we were to, I think the founders would be very surprised with how much power is concentrated within the office of the presidency today. Here we are in the third decade of the 21st century. We live in a globalized world, very different from the late 18th century. Frequently, a lot of our problems are not just domestic, they're transnational, they're complex, they're big. And so this helps us understand why, power has been increasingly concentrated within this office. Crises are critical, but we live in a more interconnected and complex world that, in a sense, demands decisive executive action. I think Americans rightfully worry about the concentration of executive authority, and desire, I think, at least ideally, to claw some of that power back to the other branches when we are not in a period of crisis. The problem is that that is very hard to do, and so one kind of classic example that we use in political science on how difficult it is to claw back presidential authority uh, involves the War Powers Resolution of 1973. So during the Vietnam War, during the Nixon administration, a lot of people were upset. He ran on a campaign to kind of end the war with dignity. And then we found out that the war was being expanded. And this forced Congress to write this War Powers Resolution in an attempt to limit the power of the president to use the armed forces in a capricious manner without some type of oversight. Of course, that has been an act on the book since 1973, and it has not done a good job in terms of reining in the president's ability to kind of use the armed forces, that power that's connected to their commander in chief powers. So once power is given, it's almost impossible to get it back. The genie is out of the bottle, so to speak.
Yeah, and I don't believe there's been a president that's been willing, just here you go, I'll hand it right back to you because I don't want this anymore.
Oh, absolutely. And this is a bipartisan consensus, too. So, very famously, after the George W. Bush administration, President Barack Obama came in, criticizing surveillance, authority that was granted to the president through the passage of the USA Patriot Act. And what did President Obama do once in office? Well, the Patriot Act is continued fully intact throughout his 8 years, and likewise with the Trump administration. So, um, Republicans and Democratic presidents alike are loath to give up power once granted.
That goes to that's to the very point where we have a situation where they're loath to give it up, and Congress is I, having worked the majority of my career in Washington D.C. working for Congress, I'm kind of an institutionalist when it comes to, I've always firmly believed that the strongest branch should be the legislature, the Congression, the Congress, because we are the body of the people. People forget that we don't elect presidents when we go vote. We elect electors to elect the president. But the power of the purse, which lies with Congress, leads to another time that you had mentioned about the War Powers Act in 1974. President Nixon wasn't spending the money the way Congress intended it to be spent, so they enacted the Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974, which worked really well up until about 1980. And then Congress looked at it and said, this may be too much work to do from that standpoint. So we're not going to follow that case anymore. But they still have the power of purse, and the appropriations process is still pretty important from a position of that, and also the oversight that comes from that. Congress has got to be willing to do that oversight. And in past years, presidents up until this particular administration, no matter what the case, they've always fought things to a big degree, but in the end, they were cooperative, with Congress, because it is, we do have three, co-branches of government.
They're supposed to be co-equal branches of government, at least in theory. And that was by design. If you look at and read the Constitution, Article 1 establishes the legislature, and Article 2 establishes the executive. And that's by design. There's a hierarchy there, and there was the expectation that Congress was supposed to have the most power, but history didn't work out that way.
Well, it's always my hope that one day Congress will step up and reach back and take it. But like you say, presidents are not going to give it up uh, easily with the kind of powers that they've received over the years.
Absolutely. And at this point in our conversation, I think it's timely to have a quote from a person smarter than us, and this goes back to Lord Acton. Take on power that power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
I think that's another draw. I was just reading briefly about James Madison in the Federalist Paper number 51. He said a similar type situation that checks and balances are necessary because power does oftentimes, my words, go to the head of the leader, and if you don't check them, they don't. You could run into real abuses. As we wind down today, would you like to leave us with one thought that we should really food for thought about executive power and things as we should look to in the future?
Yes, I understand why people worry about concentrated power in the executive branch. I worry about it myself, but I think it's also important to realize that there was a reason why this power was concentrated within the office of the presidency. It really was a response to big crises, whether the Great Depression, the Cold War, uh, the attacks of September 11th, 2001. So when we ask this question, when is power too much, we must also realize that ultimately, in a democratic system of government, it is citizens who enable, to a certain degree, an expansion in power in the office of the presidency.
That goes to one of the things we've talked about the basis of this whole series of programs, why my vote and your vote counts. And
Absolutely.
on that particular thought, that's our episode for now. I want to thank Dr. John Van Benthuysen for sharing his expertise and thoughts with us today. And as always, our executive producer, Suzanne Stratford, and the SDPB technical staff for their creativity and hard work on this program. Thank you also to supporters of South Dakota Public Broadcasting who make this program possible. To view previous episodes in this series, go to sdpb.org/election. If you have comments or suggestions for future episodes, send us a note at programming@sdpb.org. Until our next short take, I'm Chuck Parkinson.